Today on Cask Convos, we are joined by Jordan Wang, the dynamic managing director of Dale Carnegie Australia. Jordan leads the legendary training organization known for transforming leaders, teams, and cultures for over a century. With deep expertise in talent, diversity, and generational leadership, Jordan's mission is simple: to build workplaces where people thrive. Let's dive in. People, data, and analytics. How does that all come together?
So when it comes to the people side of things, the ways we interact, the ways that we really accelerate goals and collaboration have changed and evolved a lot in terms of the ways that we do communicate and collaborate nowadays. But the underlying human fundamentals remain relatively fixed. Empathy and respect, almost like a need for us to work together in communities. The practice is accelerating every day now. How do we bring people along that journey? I think that's a very exciting place to be in. You look at the speed of change and how much effort has gone into preparing people for that. Maybe the 3 C's of change leadership. The credibility are the people who are driving this change, walking the walk, also walking the talk. There's the capabilities, and do we arm our teams with the right ability to communicate and clarify and do all and collaborate effectively. And then there's kind of the clarity element of that as well. Just like you think about how kind of extremely matrix organizations are now and how complicated decision-making can be when what is the actual information that we need to communicate to the team? And going away from that top-down approach, because we see that a lot. When a big change happens or something new comes onto the scene, very much it's here's a big launch event, or here's a 20-paragraph email, or here's a big announcement of some sort. How much of that actually sticks? We've got a particular formula that we follow. So like an underlying approach to Dale Carnegie, we call it the transformation formula. And it's very much around, if I want a performance change, a performance shift, yes, there's the behavior. What are the processes? What are the behaviors that support that? And then there's this emotional change. What is the mindset required to buy into this? What happens a week or two later if I haven't addressed the underlying habits and behaviors? Really easy to kind of go back to where things are. And so a lot of, I think, what we focus on is culture, and it's psychological safety. It's really all of that stuff that we've got to get right at the very beginning, because then you can prepare your teams for almost anything.
Welcome to Season 2 of Cask Convos and our new home, the Urban Alley Brewery, right at the heart of Melbourne, District Docklands. Born from a love of great beer and a mission to bring world-class brews to Melbourne's doorstep, Urban Alley has been crafting award-winning beers that bridge the gap between mainstream and craft, blending tradition with innovation. With a state-of-the-art 25-hectoliter brew house and a 690-person brew pub, this is where bold flavors and even bolder conversations come to life. But great ideas don't just happen over a pint. They need the right space to grow. That's why we are teaming up with Natural Velocity, a co-working hub built for innovators and game changers. Because whether it's in business or at the bar, the best ideas happen when the right people come together. So grab a drink, pull up a chair, and let's dive in. Welcome, Jordan. Welcome to Cask Convos. We are very excited to have you on board. And you've been doing some very interesting things from somebody who's been purely into technology and now into people and essentially nurturing people. Tell us a bit more about how it all started.
Sure. Look, thank you again for the privilege to be on this podcast. I think it's a fantastic conversation and love to contribute to it. So for me, I started academically in technology, studied a degree in computer science. A lot of that was personal interest for one, but also there was I would say a cultural expectation in some ways, to do something that was maybe a little bit predictable in your career. Yeah. So, I really enjoyed that degree, but it taught me problem solving in a very particular way. You come into a situation, you kind of find the pain points, you make the hypothesis, and you kind of debug and kind of just progress through in that way. I had the privilege of really getting involved in a lot of leadership organizations, a lot of student kind of clubs, and things that were really involved working collaboratively with people. A lot of projects and volunteering opportunities at the time, and I think it just gave me such a good insight into what it took to really see a difference Especially when compare that up with the technological advancements, very logical thinking, and like it was such a diverse approach. So I just kind of went further and further, and I had the opportunity to do a Dale Carnegie course, as well as just a lot of other kind of projects at the time, and just convinced that there was a good way to bring these two worlds together. Yeah, so now I'm very much in that people space, but more that people strategy space. So how do we still use good data, good analytics, just to really allow the people element to blossom?
Okay, and that's very interesting. People, data, and analytics. How does that all come together?
Yeah, it's look. I think there's a good quote about this. They said that when you compare it to, let's say, the practice of engineering, especially in our world on organizational development and learning and development, the practices evolve and change all the time, but the underlying fundamentals of physics remain relatively fixed. And so when it comes to the people side of things, I mean, the ways we interact, the ways that we really accelerate, goals and collaboration have changed and evolved a lot in terms of the ways that we do communicate and collaborate nowadays. But the underlying human fundamentals remain relatively fixed, around empathy and respect, and this almost like this need for us to work together in communities. And so I think from that point of view, it's the practices accelerating every day now. But how do we bring people along that journey? I think that's a very exciting place to be in.
And you've said something very, very important over there. The human side of things being fixed, and this is something which we need to hold on to in this rapidly changing world where technology is rapidly evolving.
Yeah.
The markets are evolving.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're literally doing their ups and downs, and we'll come to that as well.
Yeah.
But very rightly said, human fundamentals don't change, and that is something which we need to continue to hold on to if we want to, have some degree of sanity in everything that's going on.
Completely agree.
So how does that translate to organizations? We at dotinfinity also have been working quite a lot, and one thing which we try to keep doing is bringing the human back into the conversation.
Fantastic.
But you guys look at it from a very different perspective. Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to this idea of people strategy, especially in an organizational setting, you think about the things that are done from a very structural process, technology point of view. And then you have the people side of things, which is very behavioral, which is very kind of mindset, and it's buy-in. And we've worked in this space for many years now, and we've kind of gone through a lot of different elements of transformation. I remember even a few years back when kind of agile and all of that, the methodology was like a big part of this. There was so much emphasis on like scrum masters and squads, and all this way of scaling up teams and trying to distribute in decision making. And at the end of the day, for the average team member, all of this stuff was going on around them, and you step into that role finally of this changed world, and it's like I don't quite know what to expect anymore. And we saw a lot of organizations go through this supposed redistribution of power and collaboration and how work was done. But then some of the more underlying habits and behaviors didn't shift. And so all of this stuff ended up becoming quite performative as opposed to transformative. And so, I think we're seeing a little bit of that even now. There's so much on AI integration and automation, and and even just kind of restructuring in general, especially in Australia currently. And it's like, what is the people element to this? I mean, how much emphasis is being placed on allowing people to come along with you on the journey as kind of technology and the processes around you evolve? And so we spend a lot of time in that particular area because it's still about culture. It's still about giving people a place to be safe, to be themselves, to be able to contribute. And it's not just that top-down approach of here's all the information, go and do something about it. Because we know that doesn't actually work.
And that's one of the things which is fundamental to technology transformations, because transformation is happening everywhere across the world. Every industry, every company, every domain, it feels the need to transform, especially with AI in the picture. But cultures are different. People are very different. Their aspirations and motivations are different. What are some interesting insights which you have found, especially from an Australian perspective?
I mean, I would say you look at the speed of change more than anything else. It's every day there's a new breakthrough in some way. And right now we're kind of on this cusp of, let's say, agentic AI. AI agents coming in and really transforming the way that we interact. I mean, I don't think the wider society is almost prepared for this big shift. I mean, it's kind of like when ChatGPT came onto the scene. Overnight, the way we work started to shift. And so you look at the speed of change and how much effort has gone into preparing people for that. I mean, there's almost, if you break it down, there's like maybe the 3 C's of change leadership or change management. There's the credibility piece. Are the leadership and are the people who are driving this change, walking the walk and also walking the talk. There's the capabilities. Do we arm our teams with the right ability to communicate and clarify and do all and collaborate effectively? And then there's kind of the clarity element of that as well. Just like you think about how kind of extremely matrix organizations are now and how complicated decision making can be especially when you consider the global elements of a lot of this stuff currently happening. So, like, what is the actual information that we need to communicate to the team? Going away from that top-down approach, because we see that a lot. When a big change happens and something new comes onto the scene, very much it's here's a big launch event, or here's a 20-paragraph email, or here's a big announcement of some sort. How much of that actually sticks? I mean, I'll receive an email nowadays on some big announcement on something, and if I try to recall that email, maybe even 2 weeks later, I might remember one sentence or one little bit from it, and it's like we need to shift from that type of communication. How do we make it more bottom up? How do we support people to find what they need to know, kind of almost intrinsically where to go? And I think that's a large trend we'll start to see.
What are some of the pitfalls that you might have seen when these kind of changes happen and people in the picture haven't been taken into consideration, especially from an outcome perspective? What are some things which you've observed in the industry?
I think what happens a lot, there's a lot of check the box activity. There's a lot of meetings that usually happens when change happens. To clarify things over and over again. Right?
We all have been in that meeting black hole.
Yeah, absolutely. One meeting to another meeting to discuss what's going to be in the next meeting. There's a lot of that, right? There's a lot of the, people telling each other we're going to be okay, but what does that actually mean? There's a lot of potentially awareness on what's going on, but what are we doing about it? So there's a lot of this stuff. And again, it's, coming back to that example earlier, you don't want any of this to be performative, because then people realize this is all done just to check a box, just to show that something has been done, but it doesn't actually address anything.
Correct, and I do remember such a activity which has happened in the past as well. In one of the organizations where I was working, there was a huge transformation which was happening, and they spent a lot of time. They actually did a organization-wide training activity, and everybody got quite excited as to what is this training all about. But eventually the training was all about, yes, it did inform that there are big changes happening and we need to prepare ourselves for the future, but more than that, it was just about how to communicate that this change is happening in a positive manner, and that's it. I think, and that's where towards the end of it, people felt very lost, because yes, they knew the change was coming. They could communicate about it in a positive manner to the rest of the population, but they were not prepared for it themselves. Like, what did it mean for them? There was no communication on that. What did it mean for their specific roles? What did it? How would their roles evolve? And that created so much of anxiety. And I remember there was this mass exits which were happening before the change, and all the good people I've seen tend to leave during these activities before the change happens. All the people who are very complacent stay on, and then they are met with redundancies and whatnot, or they are just reshuffled into these different batches and organizations, and that's about it. So the organization sets itself up for failure.
And especially right now when a new thing is kind of coming out every 3 to 6 months. I mean, something that needs to be implemented, and so you go through this tick the box and all of this activity, and then 3 months later it's like, well, something else is happening now. We've got to shift in another gear. And I mean, we've got a particular formula that we follow. So like an underlying approach, Dale Carnegie. We call it the transformation formula. And it's very much around if I want a performance change, a performance shift. Yes, there's a behavior. What are the processes? What are the behaviors that support that? And then there's this emotional change. What is the mindset required to buy into this or to help people around me buy into this? I often compare it with, a simple example is if I want to live a healthier life and I choose to, let's say, run a marathon or something, I could do all the right things. I could eat well and exercise and accountability and all of that. But then let's say if the day comes and I run the race and I tick it off and feel really good, what happens a week or two later if I haven't addressed the underlying habits and behaviors? Really easy to kind of go back to where things are. And so a lot of, I think, what we focus on is it's culture, and it's psychological safety. It's really all of that stuff that we've got to get right at the very beginning, because then you can prepare your teams for almost anything.
And what are certain fundamentals that you found about these kind of cultural changes? You mentioned psychological safety, the people feeling safe about the change. What about motivation? How can we get them motivated about embracing change and not feeling at risk because of it?
And I think this is when we need to challenge some of these, let's say, workplace expectations. For example, there's a lot of talk about work-life balance. I completely get it. I completely get where it's coming from. But if you actually think about it, it's not like that TV show Severance. You can't have necessarily work-life balance in that way, because if you put a hard kind of break between work and life, you're trying to live two lives almost. And so, what we always encourage organizations to do, it's more this idea of work-life integration. Right? How do you create a workplace and a culture that allows people to want to be there? Now, I completely get that the work is difficult. There's going to be a lot of pressure. I mean, as naturally there would be. But still, there's things that we could do to allow people to feel recognized and part of the winning, and to feel that sense of fulfillment and purpose and work as they would in life. And so, some of these things, you come back to psychological safety. What does it actually mean to create a sense of belonging across teams and across people? And if you can do that to a high level, suddenly you don't really have a workforce anymore. It's not, a human resource anymore, but rather you've just got a good group of people, willing to go to battle with you.
In a very fundamental point around psychological safety, and I feel that is also one of the pillars of innovation. Once, if people feel safe in this space, then they feel okay to innovate as well, or think outside the box, because unless you're happy about your space in your mind in terms of your career, where you are, and then that hunger for that next challenge comes.
Completely agree.
And I feel that is one thing which we really need to inject into Australian workforces a lot more. That hunger for innovation.
Yeah. And I put it this way. I would say Australians. We're as a nation, we're actually quite innovative, but it's around how do we actually utilize that innovation in some ways, or set up the environment to allow that to happen more organically in a professional setting. I think a good example of that is you think about how much kind of self-limiting belief we all place on ourselves. How much the subconscious actually drives our decision making. We could have very good theoretical approaches to how things should be, but then you're in an environment in which, let's say, fear or hesitation or even just kind of reaction to a scenario, suddenly you naturally, without even thinking about it, go in a different direction. I remember dabbling as a graphic designer very early on in my career, and a lot of that it's around trying to think about what am I being expected to create here, and trying to force that creativity and trying to pigeonhole it in a particular way doesn't really work. It's exactly like what you're saying. How do you allow people to feel comfortable with themselves, to that their ideas are valued, and that's where real creativity comes out.
Exactly, and especially in an organizational setup, I think people should feel okay to voice different ideas, voice something which is out of the box, and not feel that they will have to have any repercussions around it, or just have that fear of failure or fear of ridicule just because they thought of a different approach.
Exactly.
I've seen some of the best innovators in my career come when they haven't been afraid of trying something
Yeah,
new.
yeah,
And I sometimes miss that, being an entrepreneur.
yeah,
You're not surrounded by as many people,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
you miss that team culture where there might be somebody who's coming up with a different
yeah,
idea out of the
yeah,
box, and then at times it just rallies the entire
yeah,
team up to
yeah.
try something different.
Exactly right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's almost like this idea of idea fluency. I mean,
Yes.
oftentimes when it comes to structured innovation, we may kind of throw out that first or second tier of innovation, creativity, and it makes sense. It's more kind of iteration based, but then you keep digging further and further, and suddenly you get stuff that's kind of just very very different. I mean, you and I could have an exercise right now where we, let's say, look at this cup, and how do we innovate this glass, right, to be the best product out there. And I mean, we could go back and forth for a little bit and have some small additions to it. But if we chatted about this particular glass for an hour, I'm sure we'll come up with some really cool, really cool things,
I'm
right?
sure.
Not that we should do that right now, but
Yeah. I'm happy to debate about this glass
yeah,
as long as it has a good whiskey in it.
yeah, that's it. Yeah,
Um, One thing which you touched on was fear, and we are seeing a lot of fear happen right now with the crashes of the stock
yeah,
market,
yeah,
and the swings and ups and downs, and some
yeah,
crazy reactions,
yeah,
and essentially people being very reactive. And I think it all comes from this place of fear, this fear that, okay, how is this change going to
yeah,
affect us
yeah,
as an economy, affect, or rather more as an individual level as well.
yeah, yeah.
Um, how can we be more resilient to it?
Sure, sure. Like that's a great question. I think a lot of the times when we talk about resilience, it's framed up in a way of just being kind of tough and just to power through things. And again, that's not how people are built. You get to a certain point, you're wound so tight that it's really terrible in terms of consequences. And so you think about resilience, especially in the face of uncertainty. I mean, the markets, you look at this even this week, right? What it actually comes down to, there's always going to be stuff out of our control. I mean, you hear the old adage around the 85% of the things that's out of our control you shouldn't worry about, and 15% then you can still manage, and all of this stuff. But it's easy to say these words. To tell someone just don't worry about it doesn't actually solve anything. Right? I mean, you think about the stuff that we get stressed about, everything from decision making to people to finance to hobbies, etc., etc. And oftentimes we try to just address this in like a band-aid solution. Let me go on a vacation. Let me do something else, and let me go have to do something fun. But I come back and the problem is still there, and it may have even compounded. And so I think when it comes to resilience, it's actually taking some very fundamental steps to provide as much assurance and certainty to people around you as possible. I mean, look, the most basic thing sometimes, for example, what is the worst case scenario? And really breaking it down just to allow people to realize, okay, so even the worst case scenario, manageable, right? And then it kind of builds from there, right? I mean, let's get all the facts, let's get all the data. I mean, don't react on one piece of news, right? And it's, you see, great innovators and great leaders, they do this very well intrinsically. They kind of know how to stay calm under pressure. And it's, I know it's like that whole example around a duck on water. Right? You're very calm on the surface, but you're thinking, you're doing a lot of things under the surface, and so it's really that, right? Like, how do we actually put the steps in place to allow our workplace and our people around us feel safe? Provide as much certainty and clarity as we possibly can.
So I think in a way you are talking about the fact that almost every transformation exercise, a technology transformation or business transformation, needs to be fundamentally rooted in cultural transformation.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
would that be correct?
absolutely, right? Because one thing that's never going to change is how much of this sense of belonging and togetherness is like hard coded into our brains. I mean, this is still a very primitive kind of caveman brain, and back then, it's if you didn't have a community, there's a good chance you'd be under some real danger. I mean, even nowadays, you think about the scenario in which, let's say, a manager taps you on the shoulder and says, "Come with me. We need to have a conversation," and immediately the heart starts pounding, right? The fear kicks in, because it's less about. I mean, what's the worst case scenario? I may lose my job. But is that really something I'm terrified of? I mean, if you logically look at things, be able to kind of put yourself back in a position of success again, it's not necessarily that difficult. But what it is this fear sense that I'm being almost ostracized from the community, and it's that particular. I mean, that's just one small example of all the things that's kind of in our heads that's hard coded in, of how do we address it. I'll give an example. There was a great experiment conducted in the UK. They go to train stations and pouring down with rain, and they'd ask a stranger, "Can I please borrow your phone? I need to make an important phone call." And most times people said, like, "I'm sorry, I can't give you my phone. I don't know you. Apologies." And then they flipped it a little bit, added a few extra words at the beginning, which was, "I'm so sorry about the rain. Can I please borrow your phone to make an important phone call?" And they found that was 6 times more effective in terms of having someone hand you, a stranger, their phone. And it just sort of shows, just through small things that we can do to elicit the sense of like togetherness, that we're in this together, to show that empathy. And you think about all the possibilities in the modern workforce, in today's environment. I mean, there's a lot we can do.
That's something very interesting you have mentioned over there. Just that one sentence sparking
Yeah,
a very different response, and almost building that common ground
yeah,
where both the parties were experiencing the rain,
yeah,
and that kind of reiterating that itself built that amount of trust that people could hand over their phones.
yeah. And that's what I mean. It's hard coded in our brains because if we were 2K people that met on the plains of somewhere, and I didn't quite know you, didn't quite know me, I'd be sussing you out. But then as soon as I exhibit some type of behavior that tells you, "Hey, look, we're in this together," suddenly that changes everything. Yeah.
What has been some of the hardest things or hardest places that you've encountered when going through these kind of cultural transformations in an organization? Some of the biggest challenges.
Sure. I mean, like, there's always going to be this crossroads sometimes on performance, productivity, profits. I mean, however you want to kind of categorize that, and then the people element. And I mean, I think a lot of the frustration sometimes comes from if we haven't set the foundation of culture, of expectations, of clarity, etc., of leadership, and we're expected to pursue a particular path that we know will take genuine effort, and we miss the mark. I think that's when we see a lot of conflict potentially happening, a lot of tension. So we've had the great privilege of working with some great companies. A lot of our clients are large global organizations, the ASX 200 type companies. And even in an organization with so much talent, it's easy to miss that foundational piece sometimes. And so, how do we resolve conflict? And when we talk about psychological safety, it's not saying come in and be exactly who you are and don't worry about anyone else and all of that. No, it's around how can you be the best version of yourself without the fear of consequence, because we still need to have difficult conversations, but in a very genuine, humane way. And it's just some of that type of scenario. I think we do see a lot currently.
And it's quite interesting that we are right now in this world where there's a lot of distrust which is happening, especially between employees as well as organizations, and with this fluctuations in the market, fluctuations in the economy, and a pandemic that just got over, and people are still recovering in some ways from it, coming back to the workplace or not coming back to the workplace. It's really hard to get that together, especially when you look at people who are remote, you look at people who are on site. How do you guys meet that sort of challenge?
And you've, I think, hit the nail on the head. I mean, trust is everything. And you think about that quote. I mean, I'll forget what you said and I'll forget what you did, but I'll always remember the way you made me feel. And I think that's so true nowadays. With the ways that we interact, like you described. I mean, it doesn't matter at the end of the day whether we're in person or online. And I get that some formats or some settings make things maybe a little bit easier to connect, to be able to kind of build that bond. But at the end of the day, it's still how do we make some of those core principles a focus? trust, authenticity, respect for each other, recognition, celebration, like some of these things, because that comes through in different ways. I think especially now we live in a world where everything's a battle for attention. I mean, you're on your computer and your Slack's going off and Teams and this and email and it's so easy to be distracted through all of this. But if you think about it, I mean, humans again, we're not made to be multitaskers. Actually, at the end of the day, we're actually really good at focusing on one thing at a time. But the way the world has kind of developed is everything is all about multitasking, and so it's actually less about whether it is work from home or whether it is remote or whatever the setting is. But it's like, how do we just bring that focus, energy, that authentic energy back into any conversation? And like coming from a very technical background, at least this academically, I get the productivity gains, let's say, that optimizing something will be able to bring. And I think there's a really interesting conversation right now because we're going in this trend of AI-enabled decision making. And you think about the future when AI is so advanced that decision making, analyzing risk, I mean, all of that will be so bulletproof because all the scenarios will be considered, everything would possibly be taken into context. And then even from an implementation point of view, it's going to be so optimized. And so what is then your actual, let's say, competitive advantage? It's people. I mean, can you get people along with you then on this journey?
So now, speaking of AI and how things are changing in the workplace, a lot of decision making has been replaced by AI tools. And people fear that soon they will be replaced by AI augmented tools, and there will not be a need for a lot of certain tasks or a lot of different jobs. Have you guys also encountered these kind of questions when you are training people or training the workforce?
Like it's a very natural thing that pops up. It's how do we future-proof our organization 5, 10, 20 years? And look, some things will absolutely change. I mean, the ways that we interact and collaborate and accelerate decision making, I mean, that'll all be enhanced in a lot of ways. And and I get the conversation right now. It's how do we? It's not kind of humans versus AI. It's humans with AI. But what does that actually look like? I mean, I'd be very arrogant to say that this is what it will look like. I mean, there's ways we can kind of predict some things. I trust that as a collective, especially globally, there's going to be a way for us to figure out the right system for it. And if we focus on some of those fundamentals, like I mentioned before, we're always going to want to still come together in the right communities and still to kind of collaborate together. I mean, you think about how tough COVID was at the end of the day, and it wasn't just through the actual issue itself, but you look at some of the social anxiety that kind of came through, some of that, just that loneliness. It's a strange thing when you think about the internet. It allowed us to connect with everyone in the world, and yet we're starting to see this shift on loneliness that's more prevalent than ever. And so it's again, how do we create that environment that people still has the opportunity to come together, and we can see almost, at least in our industry, you're less trying to get people together to learn something, but rather it's how do we create those in-person experiences that allows a different type of breakthrough. It's like I can watch any movie I want on Netflix or on any kind of streaming platform. But why do I still go to the cinemas? It's a different experience at the end of the day. And I think once we figure that part out, it'll make a massive difference.
And while you were speaking, one thought which crossed my mind was, do you think with everything that's going on, organizational training also needs to evolve in a certain way? And how would a Dale Carnegie respond to everything that's changing?
Yeah, and we're seeing this in real time, and that it's no longer about trying to teach information. I mean, this idea of knowledge is power. I mean, that died 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? It's all about how do you bring in the relevant information, or how do you act. Let's say you're confronted with a particular situation, difficult conversation or negotiation or leadership decision making or something like this. It's like, how do I actually recall what I need in the moment I need it, and then know instinctively how to apply it. And I think in our industry, it's really shifted away from just here's this like knowledge and information dump, but rather we're working a lot with organizations through a very structured manner on how do we bring that to life. So how do we practically allow people to be, that more professional, that better version of themselves in that setting. So we're doing less, let's say, training courses per se, actually a lot less, and really shifting to designing and rolling out graduate programs and setting up leadership frameworks and capability training and rolling out kind of sales approaches and behavior and so it's more kind of organizational development, I would say, has been a big shift for us, because we will start to see a more commoditization of coaching, of learning, and we're seeing it already with short courses and AI avatars undertaking coaching and things like this. So yeah, I think all of that will start to shift.
Yeah. Do you think AI coaches will replace actual teachers?
Oh, I mean, it's hard to tell, because you look at how realistic some of that stuff is already, and hard to tell.
I wish that doesn't happen. I feel some of the best learning that I've had in my career has been through great teachers, great mentors, great people in the workplace, even colleagues. The kind of learning that you can get from your own team of people, from your environment. It is so phenomenal, which, I wouldn't want to sit in front of a computer and do a checklist of tasks.
Yeah, and I completely get that, because it's all about how do we shift emotions at the end of the day, and shift emotions for the benefit of having, allowing, let's say, change to happen. But then you think about, every now and then we'll watch a really good movie or a really good TV show or some kind of media that allows us just to feel those emotions, and it really sticks with us. And if AI teachers or coaches or avatars kind of progress to a point where they can make that read and still deliver on that emotional promise, I mean, I could see that being potentially a challenge to the industry. But then again, what won't go away is kind of bringing people together in a group and really collaborating in that manner. I think some of those factors will never change.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Well, Jordan, we are generally a technology podcast, but we had some very different flavor with you today. You have given us that insight into how fundamental the human side of things is. So thank you so much for that. Any last thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would say it's, one thing we're seeing a lot. It's technology, AI, and again, coming from that world, I understand the multiplier effect. I understand the ability to scale almost everything as a result of these enablers. And it then comes just back down to, we can have all the theory in place. We can have, companies are investing millions of dollars, tens of hundreds of millions of dollars to get the right systems and processes and technology in place. But if people don't use it, and there's already research out there that says, 5 to 10% are actually utilizing AI in the workplace, even though organizations have spent hundreds of millions implementing these fancy systems, because it comes down to adoption, right? Again, how do we, as leaders, as organizations, allow people to feel safe, to feel like this can contribute, to remove some of these barriers on fear and beliefs and expectations, etc., and just really bring these two worlds together. It's technology and people. And having been involved in both worlds, I can see all the possibilities. These two things are not separate with each other. There's definitely a nice synergy that can come together.
Very well said. And how do people get in touch with you guys?
Yeah, so we represent Dale Carnegie here in Australia, a global organization. But you can find us on LinkedIn. We have a website. I would say we have a good social and as well as a digital presence. So feel free to chuck us into a Google search and look for the Australia team.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jordan, for coming and joining us today. It's been lovely having you and some great conversations. I really hope that you guys continue to do this work, and Australia could definitely do with a well thought out transformation. So
thank you, Shivani.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. From data management and product innovation to regulatory compliance, whether it's optimizing costs or enhancing efficiencies, dotinfinity is your partner for solving tricky problems with a human-centric and tech-powered approach. Connect with us at contact@dotinfinity.co.